We are honored by your presence, and we thank you for that. The program is part of the Mois de la Francophonie, so it's the French-speaking cultural festival that is held every year in DC in the month of March. And the program is jointly organized by the Hoover Institution, the Embassy of Belgium, Wallonia-Brussels International, the Embassy of Canada, the Quebec Bureau, and McGill University Alumni Association. 100 years ago, a wonderful story of intercontinental friendship and of large-scale philanthropy between the United States and Belgium took place thanks to a handful of generous businessmen under the leadership of Herbert Clark Hoover, who was to become the 31st president from 1929 until 1933 during the Great Depression. You are about to learn of that historic episode from three distinguished out-of-state guests, one coming from Wisconsin, one from Massachusetts, one from New York, each bringing his or her own perspective. But before I introduce them, let me thank the Hoover Institution for the warm welcome, and particularly Paige Mathis, Senior Manager, Washington, D.C. Program, and Aaron Nichols, Event Coordinator. I would also like to recognize the following people. Christophe Payot. Christophe, if you want to stand up. Christophe is le chargé d'affaires at the Embassy of Belgium. Mr. Payot represents Ambassador Waters, currently in Belgium. Christophe wishes to excuse himself as leaving early. He must attend the official kickoff of the Francophonie Festival at 6 p.m. at the Armenian Embassy. Armenia will host the Francophonie Summit later this year in its capital, Yerevan. Brigadier General Georges Franchomme, Defense Military, Air and Naval Attaché at the Embassy of Belgium. Colonel Thomas Doon, Canadian Armed Forces, Air Attaché at the Embassy of Canada. And also I want to recognize Justin Margolis. Justin, there you go in the back. Justin is the Public Affairs Administrative Assistant, Bureau du Québec à Washington, Quebec Government Office in Washington. I will introduce our speakers as they come to the floor, but first we are going to have a reading of a poetry in Flanders Field, in English, in Dutch and French. And to introduce that famous poem from World War I from Belgium, I'm calling Colonel Thomas Doon.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you for a couple minutes today about the poem in Flanders Fields and the history of the poppy, or the coquelicot in French, as a symbol of remembrance. This year marks the 100th anniversary of Armistice Day. And every November 11th, on Remembrance Day, Canadians, along with our allies, gather to remember those who have given the ultimate sacrifice. And standing out brightly on each lapel, like we have today, on a typically cold and windy Canadian day, is a red poppy. The poppy is a symbol of those same flowers found in Flanders Fields. Indeed, many of the letters created by the Belgian children and displayed here today are decorated with drawings of poppies. La tradition importante du port du coquelicot est souvent considérée comme un symbole et un acte de commémoration dans les pays du Commonwealth. Mais l'histoire nous enseigne des fondements américains solides sous-tendant la pratique du port de coquelicot. C'est une histoire qui est plutôt méconnue. The important tradition of wearing a poppy is often seen as a symbol and act of remembrance for Commonwealth nations, but history tells us of the strong American foundation that underpins the practice of wearing a poppy, and this is a history that is not commonly known. The origins of the poppy do lie with the poem in Flanders Fields, written a century ago by Canadian surgeon and professor of pathology at Montreal's McGill University, Lieutenant Colonel John Alexander McCrae. And you'll see the original version of the poem here on my right. McCrae also has a local connection, having spent 3 years as a resident at Johns Hopkins University. And during World War I, McCrae was the officer in charge of medicine at the 3rd Canadian General Hospital, the crown jewel of the Canadian Army Medical Corps, a battlefield hospital in northern France staffed by physicians, nurses, and students from McGill and its affiliated hospitals, Montreal General and the Royal Victoria. And in this famous poem, which you'll hear in a moment, in English, French, and Dutch, McCrae spoke of the tragedies in Belgium in World War I and of the importance of remembrance. The last verse of the poem transfixed an American woman from Georgia named Moina Bell Michael during a visit to New York City. And on November 9th, 1918, with the armistice just 2 days away, she came across McCrae's poem in the Ladies' Home Journal. Le poème l'a inspirée. Sa vision était de créer un motif national unique pour rappeler tous ceux tombés à la guerre. En décembre 1918, elle a donc créé un coquelicot coloré réunissant les couleurs de tous les drapeaux alliés et entrelacés par la flamme de la liberté. The poem inspired her. Her vision was for the creation of a single national motif to act as a reminder for all those lost in war. In December 1918, she produced a poppy colored with all the hues of the Allied flags and intertwined with the torch of liberty. By 1920, Ms. Michael convinced the Georgia Department of the American Legion to adopt the memorial poppy as its symbol without the torch of liberty motif. And at the National American Legion Convention in Cleveland, the memorial poppy was adopted as a countrywide symbol of remembrance, with the idea that the American Legion members and the public would wear it every Remembrance Day. Madame Anna Guérin, originaire de France, était aussi présente à cette même convention de 1920. Elle a vite vu les possibilités de vente d'un grand nombre de coquelicots artificiels dans son pays d'origine, et dont les recettes pourraient venir en aide à ceux qui souffraient des séquelles de la guerre, en particulier les enfants orphelins. At that same convention in 1920 was a woman from France, Madame Anna Guérin. She saw the possibilities for the sale of large numbers of artificial poppies in her home country, with proceeds going to help those who were suffering from the after effects of war, particularly orphaned children. Guérin traveled extensively, and in the space of 4 years, the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Australia, and New Zealand had adopted what we now call the Remembrance Poppy, le coquelicot du souvenir. A Canadian officer's poetic creativity, a Belgian battlefield, an American's idea, French determination, and finally global acceptance. An amazing story, and one that brings together friends, partners, and allies every year to remember all those who have given the ultimate sacrifice for our nations. These are the words written by Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
Hi, good evening, and I'm going to read the two other versions in Dutch and in French. In Vlaanders velden bloeien de klaprozen, tussen de kruisen, rij aan rij, die onze plaats aanwijzen. En aan de hemel blijven de leeuweriken vliegen en dapper kwelen, tussen het geschut, beneden nauwelijks te horen. We zijn de doden. Enkele dagen geleden nog leefden we, voelden de ochtendstond, zagen de gloed van de avondzon, beminden en werden bemind. En nu liggen wij, gevelden, in Vlaandersvelden. Zet onze strijd met de vijand verder. Met falende handen reiken wij u over de toorts. Aan u, haar hoog te dragen. Doet gij dit niet, dan zullen wij in deze aarde geen rust kennen, ondanks de klaprozen in Vlaandersvelden. Au champ d'honneur, les coquelicots sont parsemés de lot en lot auprès des croix. Et dans l'espace, les alouettes devenues lasses mêlent leur chant au sifflement des obusiers. Nous sommes morts. Nous, qui songions la veille encore à nos parents, à nos amis, c'est nous qui reposons ici, au champ d'honneur. À vous, jeunes désabusés, à vous de porter l'oriflamme et de garder au fond de l'âme le goût de vivre en liberté. Acceptez le défi. Sinon, les coquelicots se faneront au champ d'honneur.
Thank you, Colonel Dune and General Franchom. Now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Professor George Nash. Mr. Nash is the foremost authority on Herbert Hoover. He graduated from Amherst College in Massachusetts in 1967 and received his PhD in history from Harvard University in 1973. He's an independent scholar who lectures and consults widely. From 1975 to 1995, he lived in West Branch in Iowa to work on the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, where he wrote 3 volumes of a definitive scholarly biography ending in 1918, commissioned by the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Association. The Life of Herbert Hoover, the Engineer, 1874-1914, The Life of Herbert Hoover, the Humanitarian, 1914-1917, and The Life of Herbert Hoover, Master of Emergencies, 1917-1918. Professor Nash.
Thank you very much, Monsieur Guinan. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a distinct honor to be in your company on this occasion, under the auspices of the Hoover Institution and other sponsoring entities, in celebration of the Francophone Cultural Festival. Nearly 4 years ago, the Francophone peoples and English-speaking peoples in many nations began to mark the centenary of the First World War. The commemoration that has unfolded since then has largely been a somber one, haunted by memories of soldiers subsisting in muddy trenches and by the ghastly statistics of millions of lost lives. But there was another dimension of the Great War, as it was then called, that should not be forgotten, for out of it something positive came. It is this often overlooked aspect of the war that I've been asked to examine tonight. In August 1914, Herbert Hoover was a highly successful American mining engineer living in London. He was at the pinnacle of his profession, with business interests on every continent except Antarctica. He was also restless, confiding to a friend that just making money isn't enough. Having made a respectable fortune, he wanted, he said, to get in the big game somewhere, the big game of public life. His opportunity arose in circumstances he could never have imagined. Just a few days before his 40th birthday, most of Europe plunged into the greatest armed conflict in 100 years. On August 4th, as Great Britain declared war on Imperial Germany, Hoover wrote to a friend, "If my judgment of the situation is right, we are on the verge of 7 years of considerable privation." The American engineer was prophetic. For the next 7 years, privation did indeed engulf much of the world, and the struggle against it determined the direction of his life. In the chaotic early weeks of the fighting, Hoover and other leading Americans residing in London organized emergency relief assistance for more than 100,000 American travelers fleeing the continent of Europe for London and, they hoped, safe passage home. Hoover's efficient leadership of this effort impressed the American ambassador to Great Britain, Walter Hines Page, who, along with others, soon tapped Hoover for a far greater mission of mercy. In the summer of 1914, an invading German army overran the small neutral nation of Belgium. Dependent upon imported food for most of its consumption, yet trapped between a hostile occupier and a British naval blockade of its German enemy, the civilian population of Belgium faced starvation unless sustenance could somehow be obtained from the outside world. With the approval of Ambassador Page and the acquiescence of the warring British and German governments, Hoover established, on October 22, 1914, a neutral benevolent entity called the Commission for Relief in Belgium, or CRB, to purchase, transport, and deliver food to the beleaguered Belgian populace. Initially, no one anticipated that this humanitarian mission would last more than a few months. As Hoover himself later wrote, the knowledge that we would have to go on for 4 years to find $1 billion, to transport 5 million tons of concentrated food, to administer rationing, price controls, agricultural production, to contend with combatant governments and with world shortages of food and ships, was mercifully hidden from us. But as the clash of giant armies degenerated into a gruesome stalemate on the Western Front, Hoover's emergency ad hoc relief undertaking for Belgium turned into an elaborate enterprise without precedent in world history, an organized rescue of an entire nation from the threat of starvation amidst enemy occupation in the middle of a war. A century later, we are inclined to take for granted the prompt intervention of humanitarian agencies in areas of distress. In 1914, however, no institution for the succor of Belgium existed. It became Hoover's awesome responsibility to create one. Within a few months, Hoover and his team of mostly American volunteers built the CRB into a remarkable organization. It had its own flag. It had its own fleet. It negotiated treaties with some of the warring European powers. A British government official called it a piratical state organized for benevolence. Its leader, Hoover, enjoyed informal diplomatic immunity and traveled freely through enemy lines. The tasks that the Commission for Relief in Belgium performed were daunting. First, it had to raise money throughout the world, partly through charitable appeals, but primarily, as the war went on, through subsidies from the British, French, and eventually US governments. With this money, it had to purchase wheat and other foodstuffs from the United States, Canada, South America, and Australia. Then it had to ship these foodstuffs across the ocean to Belgium. When its ships entered the European war zone, they were required to navigate carefully, lest they be seized by the British Navy or subjected to German submarine attack. And when the food-laden vessels reached the neutral Dutch port of Rotterdam, their cargo had to be unloaded for conveyance by canal into isolated Belgium. Once inside the occupied country, the supplies had to be prepared for human consumption in mills, dairies, and bakeries. Then the food had to be distributed equitably among more than 7 million men, women, and children scattered over more than 2,500 villages, cities, and towns. As part of its multifaceted work, the CRB needed to verify that the daily food allotments reached their intended recipients and not the German Army of Occupation, which had pledged not to steal the food or interfere. Working with Hoover and his mostly American staff was a devoted network of tens of thousands of Belgian volunteers who handled the distribution of food throughout their land. This parallel Belgian organization was known as the Comité National de Secours et d'Alimentation. At its head were some of the country's most eminent business leaders, including Ernest Solvay and Émile Franqui. As if all this were not enough, in early 1915, Hoover's organization was permitted to extend its life-sustaining operations to French civilians, subsisting in desperate conditions on French territory held by the German army on the Western Front. Under the ever-watchful eyes of German military officers, Hoover's CRB volunteers supervised the importation, storage, and distribution of food to more than 2 million French men, women, and children living in more than 2,100 communes under enemy control, a strip of territory nearly the size of the American state of Massachusetts. Thus, the CRB's work came to encompass a total area of more than 20,000 square miles. One object of special solicitude was young people. It was our task, and the Belgians, Hoover wrote later, to maintain the laughter of the children, not to dry their tears. Thanks to the CRB's external fundraising and food imports and the dedicated zeal of Belgian volunteers, the challenge was impressively met. By early 1917, 3/4 of Belgium's children were receiving daily hot lunches at canteens established especially for that purpose. Between 1914 and the cessation of its work in the summer of 1919, the CRB delivered nearly 5 million metric tons of food supplies to the citizens of Belgium and German-occupied northern France. In the course of these exertions, Hoover, working voluntarily and without pay, became a Belgian hero, and you will hear much evidence of this in a few minutes from my colleague, Dr. Heingartner. Hoover also became an international hero, the embodiment of a new force in global politics, American benevolence in the form of humanitarian aid programs. In 1916, Lord Eustace Percy of the British Foreign Office described him as the advance guard and symbol of the sense of responsibility of the American people towards Europe. At home, he gained stature as a master of emergencies, as he was sometimes called, and as a symbol of practical idealism. For Hoover, the Belgian relief effort turned out to be his first great act in a long career on the world stage. When the United States entered the World War in April 1917, he returned home to head a new wartime agency, the United States Food Administration. But the relief commission that brought him fame continued to function, although in a reorganized form necessitated by the end of American neutrality and the withdrawal of American personnel from inside German-occupied Belgium. They were replaced by volunteers from the neutral nations of Spain and the Netherlands. Throughout the remainder of the war, the CRB, which Hoover continued to lead from afar, supplied and oversaw the feeding of more than 9 million people a day in Belgium and northern France. When the Commission finally closed its accounts in 1919, it found that it had spent nearly $1 billion, the equivalent of about $12 billion or perhaps 14 billion euros today. It had sustained the health and morale of the Belgian people and the civilians in northern France trapped behind German lines. It had made Hoover a renowned figure, and it launched him on what he later called the slippery road of public life, leading to the presidency of the United States. At the war's end in November 1918, President Woodrow Wilson dispatched Hoover to Europe to take charge of food distribution to a continent exhausted by war and threatened by famine and disease. While Wilson and the Allied political leaders struggled to draft a peace treaty in Paris, Hoover, as Director General of Relief and chairman of a new U.S. government agency called the American Relief Administration, or ARA, organized the disbursement of food to hungry people in more than 20 nations, including some brand new nations like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and the once again independent Poland. In the process, he helped thereby to quell the danger of communist revolutions in Central Europe. With the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in the summer of 1919, Hoover's relief and reconstruction efforts entered a new phase. The American Relief Administration was reconstituted as a non-governmental organization known as the ARA European Children's Fund, with Hoover himself at the helm. It became part of a growing empire of philanthropy that he and his associates developed to cope with the Great War's aftermath. Between 1929 and 1923, the now private ARA organized a program of relief in the interior of Soviet Russia, where the worst famine in Europe since the Middle Ages was raging. Millions of Russians died before Hoover's food supplies could reach them. But millions more survived, thanks to his provision. At its peak of operations, the ARA fed upwards of 10 million people a day and perhaps 20 million in toto in Russia. All in all, between 1914 and 1923, Hoover directed, financed, or assisted a multitude of international humanitarian relief efforts without parallel in history. During this 10-year period, nearly 10-year period, the CRB, the ARA, and numerous other governmental and private organizations delivered nearly 34 million metric tons of food to the nations and peoples imperiled by World War I and its aftermath. In today's currency, the value of this aid exceeded $60 billion. For most of this undertaking, the man with supreme responsibility was Hoover. Tens of millions of people owed their lives to his exertions. It was later said of him that he was responsible for saving more lives than any other person in history. But, and this point is crucial, when Hoover returned to America in September 1919, he did not retire quietly to private life. Most importantly, for the development of 20th century humanitarianism, in 1919 and 1920, he farsightedly undertook to institutionalize the benevolent initiatives that had catapulted him to international prominence. One of his first steps was the establishment of the ARA European Children's Fund, which provided daily meals to an estimated 3 million children in Eastern and Central Europe in the early 1920s. Another project was his creation in 1919 of an extraordinary private archive of historical documentation on the Great War, including the records of the Commission for Relief in Belgium and his other relief agencies. His ever-expanding archive and the research center and think tank that grew from it became known as the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace, one of his most enduring legacies. Other post-war Hoover initiatives focused on Belgium. More than any other American, Hoover contributed consequentially to Belgium's material and spiritual regeneration after World War I. In 1919 and 1920, as the CRB wound up its work, he arranged with the Belgian government to donate substantial sums of leftover CRB relief funds to support the rehabilitation of Belgian educational institutions and to launch a Belgian philanthropic foundation known as the Fondation Universitaire. He also used some of the surplus CRB money to establish a parallel American entity known today as the Belgian American Educational Foundation. Today, nearly a century after their founding, both the Fondation Universitaire and the BAEF remain active, further evidence of the long-range institutional consequences of Hoover's humanitarian response to the Great War. And here I may interject that today, one of Hoover's descendants, his great-granddaughter Margaret, is a trustee of the BAEF, and I believe we may hear from her a little bit in a few moments. In later years, the experience of the CRB manifested itself often in Hoover's life. After World War II, for instance, he was a catalyst for the creation of the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF. One of his associates in the CRB in World War I, Maurice Pate, became UNICEF's first executive director and remained in that capacity for about 20 years. Pate himself unabashedly called Hoover the father of UNICEF, and declared that it was Hoover who originally had the idea of setting up the fund in the framework of the United Nations. Thanks, therefore, in some measure, to Hoover's initiative and persistence, another institution for aid to the innocent was born. In the final years of his life, the memory of World War I weighed increasingly on Hoover's mind. Between 1959 and 1964, as he neared the age of 90, he wrote and published a 4-volume history of American-led enterprises in compassion, as he called them, that had delivered food to millions of people in the era of the 2 world wars. He entitled his massive narrative An American Epic. He wrote, "For thousands of years, the question, 'Am I my brother's keeper?' has echoed in the conscience of mankind. The American people were the first in history to accept that obligation as a nation." Those were Hoover's words. It was a story, he feared, that was being lost to history. A little over 100 years after the outbreak of World War I, it sometimes seems that his fear has been realized. Few Americans today have more than a hazy awareness of the First World War, let alone of Hoover's American epic. In part, this ignorance is due to the tendency of many historians to focus exclusively on the war's battles and tangled statecraft, not on those institutions and individuals who eased the suffering of non-combatants. But if the passage of time and the conventions of academic historiography have dimmed our consciousness of the humanitarian response to the Great War, the ongoing centennial of the war provides a fitting opportunity for remembrance and reappraisal. For the work of the Commission for Relief in Belgium and its successors was more than a minor episode in that conflict. It was, in fact, a pioneering effort in global philanthropy. The CRB and Hoover's other relief endeavors were among the forerunners of the vast network of transnational, non-governmental, benevolent organizations with which we are familiar today. Amid the horrors of 1914 to 1918, there emerged a profound and enduring impulse, cultivated by Hoover and others, to mitigate suffering and heal the wounds of war. This impulse did not disappear when the guns fell silent. Some years ago, the American historian Peter Viereck declared that the First World War was the worst single catastrophe in human history. In the coming months, above all next November 11th, we will have more occasions to ponder the war's appalling costs and consequences. But let us also reflect at this cultural festival and elsewhere upon the remarkable humanitarian ventures initiated and sustained by Herbert Hoover and many others who assisted and followed him. Here is one legacy of the Great War that can comfort and inspire. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nash, for such a masterful and a remarkable expose and contextualization of the SRB and President Hoover, well, Herbert Hoover. Now for an illustration, and there is no pun intended, of that episode, we are turning to Nancy Heingartner, who has a very touching story and very personal story to tell about those letters and drawings of gratitude written to her great-grandfather, Alexander Heingartner, who was Consul General of the US in Belgium during the Second World War. Nancy has a PhD in Slavic languages from Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, and she is Assistant Director for Outreach at the Institute for Regional and International Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Nancy, it's up to you.
Hello. As Bernard said, my name is Nancy Heingartner, and I have a PowerPoint presentation to share with you tonight about my great-grandfather, the US Consul in Liège during World War I. I'm really delighted to be here with you and to share a story of a treasured collection of World War I memorabilia that appeared in my family. You'll hear the story in a few minutes. The story that I'm going to share with you has instilled in me a sense of pride, not only in my family member who played a role in it, but also a sense of pride in the U.S. and its history as a beacon for humanitarianism. My paternal great-grandfather, next slide. I have a little bit of a technology impairment, so I apologize in advance. My paternal great-grandfather, Alexander Heingartner, was born in 1857 in New York City, but spent most of his youth in Canton, Ohio, where his father owned a paper mill. On December 6, 1898, when Alexander was 41 years old, President McKinley, a friend from Canton, nominated him to be U.S. Consul to Catania, Italy. After 7 years at the post in Italy, Alexander's next two posts were in the Russian Empire. 2 years in Riga, now the capital of Latvia, were followed by 3 years in Batum, a resort town on the Black Sea that's now in Georgia. On August 19, 1911, Alexander received his commission to serve as consul in Liège, Belgium. As of October 15, 1911, Alexander was authorized to exercise the functions of Consul of the United States in Liège with an annual salary of $3,000. I'll return to Alexander in a few minutes after I provide a little background on what was transpiring politically in Belgium during the early part of the 20th century, much of which will sound familiar from the previous presentation. The first half of my great-grandfather's time in Liège was really quite peaceful. In fact, in early 1914, Belgium was considered one of the most prosperous countries in the world. That ended when Germany invaded Belgium on August 4th, 1914, a week after the start of World War I. Quite quickly after the German invasion, as you heard, Belgian industry, trade, and agriculture all but came to a halt. Then in early August, due to a British naval blockade of Belgian ports, all supply routes to the country were cut off. In a country where 3/4 of the food was imported, supplies diminished rapidly. That fall, an American mining entrepreneur who was living in London at the time became aware of the plight of the Belgian people and decided to step into action. And you know already, his name was Herbert Hoover. The organizational structure he came up with, again, was called the Commission for Relief in Belgium and often goes by the acronym the CRB. After the fact, Hoover himself wrote of the CRB, the knowledge that we would have to go on for 4 years to find $1 billion to transport 5 million tons of concentrated food, to administer rationing, this novel relief organization, which went by the name of the Commission for Relief in Belgium. Oh, whoops, sorry, I forgot to advance my slide. There's Herbert Hoover. This novel relief organization, which went by the name of the Commission for Relief in Belgium, possessed some of the attributes of a government. It had its own flag, it negotiated treaties with the warring European powers, and its leaders parleyed regularly with diplomats and cabinet members in several countries. End quote. In October of 1914, after weeks of negotiation, the British agreed to let Belgian relief ships through the blockade. And bear in mind the fact that at this time the US was neutral, so it still had the ability to negotiate with both the British and the Germans on this matter. Between 1914 and 1919, it's estimated that the efforts of the CRB fed approximately 11 million Belgians. And here are just some photos from the CRB missions. Now back to Alexander Heingartner. He's living in Liège with his wife and one or both of his daughters, Ruth and Ray, when World War I breaks out. This is a diplomatic phone book listing for Alexander Heingartner. And here's a photo of the outside of the family's house, apartment building on Rue Fougère in Liège. So, as the highest-ranking American official in Liège at this time, Alexander Heingartner became a member of the CRB. And there he is, bottom of the list. And is put in charge of making sure that the Belgian relief supplies that reach the US consulate in Liège are distributed to the people who need them. If not for a discovery my father and I made in the attic of my parents' house several years ago, that would be the end of this story. The attic of my parents' house, way up there on the third floor, always held a kind of magic for me. There are 3 reasons for this. First, it's super high up, so you could spy on the neighbors from up there. That was really fun. Second, there's a massive slate pool table in the attic that, as a child, it seemed to me the house must have been built around. And the third reason is that the attic is a storehouse of the treasures that my father inherited from his parents, who both sadly died very young. After I moved away from home, my father and I would also often carry out what I affectionately call archaeological digs during my visits home. These involved selecting a suitcase or a trunk that belonged to his family, dragging it down 2 steep flights of stairs, and then going through it with a fine-tooth comb. One evening while I was visiting, at some point between fall of 2013 and spring of 2014, Dad and I ended up going through an old steamer trunk made in Liège that had the initials of my great-grandfather's youngest daughter on it. That's the trunk. My father knew this woman as Aunt Ray. So there's the tag that says it was made in Liège. When we opened up the trunk, we found Belgian lace, some antique nightgowns and underwear, a lot of elegant gloves, a few umbrellas, and a treasure hidden at the bottom. The treasure was wrapped in handmade paper, tied with pink ribbons with 2 small note cards attached. The cards are both in the handwriting of Aunt Ray's sister Ruth. When we removed, and were addressed to my father. My father is named Alexander after his grandfather. When we removed the ribbons and paper, we found a book approximately 24 inches tall and 12 inches wide. Its cover of hand-painted silk with the words "Glory and Gratitude to the United States" painted on it. The book contains a collection of handwritten letters expressing the gratitude of Liège schoolgirls to the American people for the support they and their families received from the Belgian aid campaign. The letters had been delivered to Alexander Heingartner since he was the highest-ranking U.S. official in Liège during World War I and had been responsible for making sure that the humanitarian aid from the CRB made it into the hands of people in his region. Some of the letters are plain, just black handwriting on a white sheet of paper. Others include photos and souvenirs. So on that one, I don't know if you noticed, when the corner is folded down, it says a souvenir. And then when you open it up, there's a photo of the girl who drew the map. Some are decorated simply, clearly the work of young children. Some are spectacular, almost taking your breath away and making you wonder if it's possible that they could have been created by small children. One is a poem written by a boy. a long poem, very long poem. And one is addressed to the noble President of generous America. There are a few pages that contain only drawings. There are a number of pages that have the name of a course across the top of the page and contain the signatures of the students in the course in the body. There are even two big sheets, one listing a schedule of general courses at one of the schools in Liège, the other listing a schedule of special and professional courses, all handwritten. One is a letter written in English. I'll return to this letter in a little while. The remainder are written in French by girls, and they're all from 1915. I'm now going to take a few minutes to read you four of my favorite letters. Dear little, in English, Dear Little Sisters of America, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts for the kindness you have shown us by sending us flour, potatoes, clothes, and everything we needed, as without this, many of us would have gone hungry. We, in turn, can only pray to the Lord to ask that he always preserve you from war and that he bless our dear little sisters of America, the schoolgirls, primary grades, of St. Victor School, Liège, 26 June 1915. The Meuse is the river that goes through Liège. This is from the small flowers of the Meuse to their small girlfriends. Dear little friends, calculation arithmetic is not our strong suit because we're only 8 years old. However, we know how to add up good deeds even if we do not personally know the benefactors. It is precisely because our little hearts feel so strongly that we are so eager to thank you and your fathers and mothers for doing so much for Belgium. You are luckier than us, as every evening you can give a big hug to your beloved parents. You do not see them suffer, and your beautiful country is not miserable like ours. We're happy for you, dear little friends, and we pray that good Jesus looks after you, along with all of your loved ones, and that peace reigns in the beloved America that sends us food as well as clothes, because we have benefited from the generosity that has flown from your country. Ask him, dear girlfriends, for our fathers to come back quickly so that the smiles return to our mothers' faces and to ours as well. Farewell, dear little friends from far away. We hold great affection for you in our hearts and remember you in our prayers. On behalf of all the second grade pupils, a young schoolgirl from Liège, José Leclerc, 8 years old, Saint-Sébastien School, Liège. To the little girls of America the brave. Ladies, at the outset of this frightful calamity that is striking us, we could only look ahead with terror to the consequences of this new German invasion. The threat of starvation was a particular concern. One day, just as all hope of receiving food supplies was vanishing, America the brave and the beautiful came to promise us relief and to give us bread to survive until the country regained its freedom. Now the Liège spirit has returned, and the Jerrys have a hard job keeping up their flagging prestige. I sincerely thank you for the charity you have shown the people of Albert the Great and Victorious. May you never lose your freedom and kind-heartedness. A small girl from Liège, Suzanne Davant. And one more. There we go. Dear benefactors, how can we thank you enough for everything you have done for us since our poor Belgium was invaded by the enemy? You came to our rescue so quickly that we have not experienced the horrors of hunger that threatened us. You have sent food, clothing, money, and even toys. You have taken us under your wing. We thank you with all our hearts. We have put you and your families in our prayers. In your honor, we celebrated the birthday of your dear country and sang your beautiful national anthem. As a simple token of our appreciation, we are sending you small crafts made by our own hands, and we hope that you will enjoy receiving them. Again, thank you 1,000 times. Thank you, and may God reward you for your many good deeds. 4th grade pupils, Saint Victor School, Liège. That's the last page of that letter. Here are a few of the small crafts made by our own hands that were mentioned in the letter. This is a hand-painted silk book cover, always with Belgian and American symbols, either intertwined or both appearing. Several doilies. And a table runner. So I realize that I need to start wrapping up fairly quickly here, but wanted to share with you another wonderful part of the adventure of the Belgian letters. In fall of 2014, maybe 6 months after discovering the letters, I contacted the Belgian embassy in Washington. Since I was already planning to visit DC that fall, I told the embassy staff about the letters and asked if I were to bring them along with me, might a member of the staff be able to meet so that I could show them the letters. On September 10th, 2014, I met with several members of the embassy staff, including Bernard and the ambassador at the time. They seemed as transfixed by the letters as I was. And in an effort to condense my story, suffice to say that my friends at the Belgian embassy and I have stayed in touch and ultimately made arrangements to send the letters back home to Belgium for an exhibition. The US Capitaine Library is a library of the history of Liège, and the Curtius Museum of Archaeology and Decorative Arts on the banks of the River Meuse in downtown Liège hosted an extensive exhibition of the Belgian relief campaign with the letters of gratitude featured as the central focus. The exhibition ran from December 3rd, 2015 until February 28th, 2016. That's the brochure from the exhibition. That's a very blurry photograph of the outside of the Ulysse Capitaine Library. And then here are some of the letters on display back in Liège where they had been written 100 years prior. That's the Curtius Museum, which you will see in some of the letters, including over here. Some of the kids drew a picture of the Curtius Museum in the letters. So that's inside the Curtius. On Wednesday, December 2nd, 2015, there was a pre-opening celebration that included a visit and short speech by the U.S. Ambassador to Belgium, Denise Bauer. My son, who was 9 at the time, and I were honored to be present for this grand occasion. That's the ambassador in the purplish suit. It was quite emotional for me walking the streets my relatives had walked 100 years earlier. This is my son at the entryway to 11 Rue Fourgeur, where his great-great-grandparents had lived. Speaking with people whose families had benefited from the Belgian aid campaign, being given the Medal of the City by the mayor, even locating, with the help of our Belgian friends, the gravesite of my great-grandfather on the central alley of a huge cemetery in Liège. Alexander coincidentally died on March 30th, 1917, a week to the day before the U.S. entered the war. Just before my son and I arrived in Liège, the city of Liège paid for a beautiful plaque commemorating Alexander's role in the Belgian aid campaign to be placed at the end of his grave. It reads, Consul General of the USA from 1911 to 1917, active in food aid to the children of Liège. It's really a fluke that these letters survive more than 100 years after they were written. The only reason they're here is because Aunt Ruth, after the death of her brother Robert, who was my father's father, had the wherewithal to set them aside for her nephew Alex, my father. Though I've been saying this for a few years now and haven't yet acted upon it, I am committed to creating a small children's book based upon the letters of gratitude, as I think the Belgian relief campaign should be a source of real pride for this country. I always close talks that I give about the letters by reading the lone letter written in English. André Lopin, a young lady at the professional middle school of Liège, wrote it. This letter in particular is a reminder in this time of many uncertainties of one of the extraordinary deeds of generosity the U.S. has performed during its history, and I quote, May I, in the name of all the schoolgirls and our families, express our heartfelt thanks to our American benefactors, who with touching solicitude have used every endeavor to relieve us from the horrors of a cruel war. With exquisite delicacy, the valiant and generous nation turned toward her suffering and dejected sister nation. You've addressed us admirable words of esteem and sympathy, which inflamed our hearts, soothed our despondency, and strengthened our confidence. You have supplied us with bread and freed us from the heartrending fear of starvation. But amongst all the proofs of your kindness, what moved the children of unfortunate Belgium most was the fraternal outburst which, from one continent to another, united us to the children of free America. We received their gifts with unspeakable emotion. We read their lovely letters. We answered them, but we could not express the gratitude which filled our hearts. May we hope, gentlemen, that you will accept to be our interpreters. Will you tell them that though we shall most probably never meet with them, we shall always love them? For we shall never forget, and our hearts flowing with gratitude, we exclaim, thank you. Hurrah for the children of America. 3 cheers for the Stars and Stripes. Liège, February 22, 1915.
Thank you very much, Nancy, for this personal testimony, and I must say it's fairly emotional. I was linked personally to, the letters of gratitude and to the exhibit in Liège, and it's wonderful. One of the letters reads also from a young child who said, thanks to you, I was able to eat a nice big red apple, which is quite something. Now, we are very honored to have today among us one of the descendants of President Hoover, Margaret Hoover. She's the great-granddaughter of President Hoover. She earned a BA in Spanish and literature with a minor in political science from Bryn Mawr College, Philadelphia. Cannot read it, it's Welsh. Bryn Mawr College in Philadelphia. Mrs. Hoover worked in the White House for the administration of George W. Bush as the Associate Director of Intergovernmental Affairs. She worked on President Bush's re-election campaign in 2004. Her writings appear in the Wall Street Journal, the Daily News, the Daily Beast, and FoxNews.com. She serves on the board of overseers of Stanford University, Hoover Institution, and on the board of Herbert Hoover's Presidential Library Association, and most importantly, I dare say, the Belgian American Educational Foundation. Margaret serves on the Advisory Council of the American Foundation for Equal Rights and Go Proud. In January 2013, Mrs. Hoover helped found the American Unity Fund, a non-profit organization dedicated to advancing the cause of freedom for gay and lesbian Americans by making the conservative case that freedom truly means freedom for everyone. In the benefit of time and snacks and Belgian beer and wine, and also interactions, I will ask Mrs. Hoover to keep her remark as briefly 2 minutes as possible, then we can enjoy and mingle, and certainly also admire all the panels we brought. We brought about 12 of them. Each one has an English translation of the letter. So, Margaret, floor is up to you. Thanks for being here. Oh, yes. Nancy mentioned also that she brought a couple of original letters that are under the plastic covers on the left-hand side of the counter. Margaret?
Thank you very much for having me. And I was really asked just to make a coda of remarks to give a little bit of a context on what has continued to be the long-range institutional contribution to Belgian regeneration post-World War I in the form of the Belgian American Educational Foundation. And this is the legacy entity of the Commission for the Relief of Belgium that was founded with $4 million at the end of World War I, and essentially retained roughly that $4 million until about the middle of the 20th century. It now sits on an endowment of $125 million, which is dedicated every year to sending 80 American postgraduate students and 120 postgraduate Belgian students to study graduate work in the opposite country. It has continued to be a source of pride that fosters Belgian-American friendship and collaboration, and sends students to study in every field of study, from visual to performing arts, visual and performing arts, the sciences, law, business, math. I said sciences. I sit on the subcommittee that selects the American students that will go to Belgium, and we every year send at least 1 or 2 carry honors, as well as scientists, lawyers, and always art history students. It is run by a gentleman who himself was a recipient of the BAEF scholarship. He was on the boat of 1977. This is what they call them, having come over in boats. He is Emile Vulpep, who is a tenured professor at Yale Medical School, and he directs the graduate scientists. He's a cellular and molecular physiologist, and he has, as a passion, really conducted really all the business of the BAEF since he took the helm at the beginning of the 80s. I will say, to the point of the letters, Nancy, it was such a beautiful presentation. And if you ever find yourself driving across the country on Interstate 80, you can exit in Iowa at exit 254, which is the West Branch exit for the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum. And there you will find, in addition to letters that Nancy, very similar to the ones that Nancy has described, scores of flour sacks with the kind of absolutely gorgeous and fastidious embroidery and notes and gestures of gratitude from the Belgian people that were among the most meaningful gifts to the Hoovers that they collected throughout the course of their life. When my great-grandmother designed her dream home in the hills of Palo Alto, which is now the home of the president of the University of Stanford, it is called the Lou Henry Hoover Home. She designed a specific room in that house, which is in the original drawings called the Belgian alcove, which was there where all of the flour sacks and lace embroidery work and thank you notes that were so meaningful to them to be displayed for their entire time that they lived there. And there was this question for Hoover whenever he went to Belgium about how the Belgians would recognize him. And if I might, just right before, this is the final thing I'll say before we indulge ourselves in Belgian beer, Hoover was not one for statues or to be really adulated or really heralded. But this question, I'm going to read a little snippet from his memoirs. There was this question of how the Belgians could express their appreciation to him in a way that he would accept, that made him comfortable. He says, "The question of European decorations rose periodically to plague me. In 1916, the Belgian king had proposed it. In November of 1917, Minister Brand Whitlock wrote to me saying that the Belgians would feel a little bit more comfortable if the decorations could be given. I replied," and he's quoting from his letter, "As to European decorations, I have complete abhorrence for all such toys. I do not want any distinctions of this kind whatever, and have often expressed this to many ends." But finally he says, "My attitude towards the decorations were that they should be given to the men and the women who, as evidence of their service. But that finally King Albert had evolved an idea of his own in creating a new order in Belgium with only one member, and that no man would not be proud of it and no person would ever receive it again. The quote, 'the friend of Belgium, an honorary citizen of Belgium,' was the king's idea. He proposed the necessary legislation to the Belgian parliament at a special session, which I was required to be present at, and witnessed that the law passed without opposition. Returning from this ceremony in company with the Belgian foreign minister, I jokingly asked him if the honorary citizen was entitled to a passport. He said in similar humor that it might be a good idea to keep the frontiers of Belgium open to me in case I ever needed sanctuary for any misdeed. The next morning, he sent me a passport marked perpetual." So a fun anecdote from Herbert Hoover's memoirs. Thank you so much, Nancy and George, for commemorating what truly was, in American history, this moment where American altruism first turned itself outward to the world in the service to the world. And that is an extraordinary legacy that we can be proud of from the great and the Great War that was truly terrible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. And this is a wonderful ending, I believe, to a very most interesting evening where we learned a lot and we shared a lot. And it's not over because we have a good half hour to drink and be merry. So again, thank you very much to Colonel Doon, to General Franchom, to Nancy, to Dr. Nash, and to Margaret. I propose a big round of applause for all of our speakers.